Hi, everyone. Welcome to this House Series event organized by ECPR. My name is Susana Salgado. I'm Principal Research Fellow at the Institute of Social Sciences, University of Lisbon, and the ECPR Academic Convener for the Method School. And I will be chairing this great event today. We have with us Professor Donatella Della Porta from the Scuola Normale Superiore in Florence. Professor Donatella Della Porta almost needs no introduction. As you know, her work and her career have been an inspiration to us all. Her research on social movements, political violence, corruption, and protest could not be more pertinent and timely, considering the developments in the world, in Europe, and in most of our own countries. Among many relevant research projects and publications, Donatella has coordinated an ERC project called Mobilizing for Democracy on civil society participation in democratization processes in Europe, the Middle East, Asia, and Latin America. Donatella's presentation today is called Deconstructing Generations in Movements. The lecture will last between 45 minutes to 1 hour, so there is still some time left for Q&A at the end. Professor Donatella, thank you so much for accepting our invitation to be here today with us. You can start when you're ready. The screen is yours.
Thank you, Susana, and thank you to all those who have participated in the organization of this event. Being so online with so many people reminds me a bit of the pandemic time. But the positive thing is that after the event is finished, we can also go out and talk about the different comments that this lecture, I hope, will help stimulating. As in pandemic time, the first challenge is to have the screen shared, and I will move to this task. Let's see if I've learned enough. Can you see it now?
Yes, perfect.
Okay. So the idea to discuss about generations in movements came up talking with Susana a few months ago because of another event that she was organized, and then we decided to move my presentation to this more open type of format. In the meanwhile, many things happen, as Susana mentioned, that bring in also new relevance to discussing the ways in which generations in movement is usually addressed and analyzed. So what I would like to do there are some voices. What I would like to do in this presentation is to map a bit the theoretical ways in which generations in movements have been addressed, also bringing in then some examples from various research in which the issues of generations has emerged in my own work, because we have worked on mobilizations of the youth, mobilizations of the students, mobilizations during a special moment of crisis. In all of this research, the element of generations emerges in two ways. One is the generations of the activists, and one is the generations more at the meso level of the organizations that participate in the protest. This is in parts overlap, but not completely. And what I want to show is the different ways in which intragenerational relationship develops, coalitions are built, the functions that different generations can perform within social movement campaigns. And I would like to start exactly to what happened between the first time I talked with Susana about these presentations and then the most recent event. It doesn't go down. Okay. Okay. Can you see the picture?
Yes, yes, it's good.
Perfect. So what we saw in the very recent months is something in part typical for social movements developing into an important wave of protest. What is typical is that young people take the lead. This is, of course, not so for any type of protest, but schools and universities have often worked as arenas in which new ideas have been developed and social movement has formed. Previous to this wave of protest, for instance, the protest of the Black Lives Matter, just in the beginning of the pandemics, at the end of the first wave of contagion in July 2020, represented also a moment in which young people took the lead of the protests. So when we reflect on the ways in which social movement generations evolve and the type of role that social movements, that young people perform in social movements, one of the elements that is important to keep in mind is that the young people have often provided the most massive basis for protest movements. They have contributed in different ways to bring in new ideas, as well as to a certain extent defend values that they've seen as betrayed or threatened by those in power that often belongs to different generations. So there has been also a tendency to consider the ways in which specific experiences of the young people have an impact on the ways in which they protest and the claims that they put forward. These generations have some specific characteristics that in part are common also with the immediately previous one, but also is very much impacted upon several crises. I've read interviews with activists of the pro-Palestine protests that have been spreading very quickly I would say at the global level. Protesters have presented themselves as people who have been born during the financial crisis and have grown up during the pandemic crisis. The facial masks that we often see in pictures and videos of the protest are also marking this type of, can I say, elements of the youth identifications. They live in a moment in which the climate crisis is very strong, and they live in a moment in which there is also much concern about the militarizations of the world. I think this type of experiences at the generational level are still to be analyzed, but one could also put forward the hypothesis that they have given these generations, once the first moment of fears and disruption were over, a particular resilience. So after you have lived through all these crises, I think what this generation is showing is that it is not a generation that is easily tamed, easily punished, or easily disciplined. It is a generation that seems to have taken from their experiences with the several crises also particular courage and in commitment to not only survive, but also to change the world. This generation has, however, not been the only one during this protest. What we saw is that this generation has been accompanied by professors, workers, often young professors, which also mean precarious workers, in moments in which the repressions has been extremely strong, taking different type of strategies, and in which the universities have been affected in all the generations that have belonged to them. I took these pictures because I want to show the intensity of the repression of this protest, and that in a very fast development have seen university professors from older generations and young students not only participating in protecting the students, but also being directly targeted by the highest and most brutal form of repressions. Two of these pictures refer to Germany, and I put them there also because it's part of my experiences in the last few days. As in many campuses in Europe and in the United States, that students had constructed in order to protest against what they see as a genocide and for sure violations of human rights. Professors have been also hit by police, often riots police, and especially they have been under the attack by politicians of different colors and by the media. The statement in German, Bettina Stark-Watzinger is the Minister of Cultures of the German government, which is a government, a coalition made by the Green, the SPD, the Social Democratic Party, and the Liberal Party, and responding to a petition that was signed by almost 1,000 professors at different universities. She says that she's shocked by the behavior of the professors, that instead of opposing Israel and Judenhass, aid for Israeli and Yiddish people, protect and defend violent students. And she says that it will not be tolerated. On the basis of this type of reactions, say in the first slide, university professors have been accused by right-wing newspapers of being perpetrators of violence and anti-Semitism, and they have been, exposed. In many cases, professors that are in precarious position and in situations in which the repressions also through the type of promises of taking away jobs and research funds are more sensible to. In the middle is United States, and it clearly shows the ways in which this convergence of different generations in the protest have impacted on the climate of celebrations for the end of the years, with students still using this type of events to express their commitment to human rights, ceasefire, and so on. So examples that I wanted to present to connect them also with the ways in which often in movements different generations then converge. So there are often movements that are started by young people, not only movements on university matter, but also feminist movement, Fridays for Futures, and so on, and then spread to activists of previous generations, or even in general to people of different generations that decide to participate in these movements. And this cooperation usually has particular value for the development of social movements. Older generations tend to act by reactivating memories of the past. For instance, students in different American universities expressed or presented their actions as inspired not only by previous events like the mobilizations against the Vietnam War or the Black Lives Matter itself, but also by the ways in which they participated in classes in which this event had been studied, analyzed, and so on. So one of the elements that is interesting to look at when thinking about generations in movement is also how sometimes memories are transferred and transformed in the interactions of activists belonging to different cohorts and bringing in the different experiences. There is also a type of say convergence and collaborations of different generations in a sort of reciprocal protections. So teachers have intervened to protect their students, but when they've been hit by repressions, often students went to protect them. This is something that is interesting to look at also in other movements, for instance, in the feminist movements, where also these interactions between different generations are also interactions oriented to caring for each other and bringing in different type of skills, ideas, and so on. There is also a cross-fertilizations of repertoires of actions. If you look at the type of protests that are developing now on the campus, they represent a sort of mix of different previously developed forms of protest. The student camps are clearly inspired by the anti-apartheid movement during the 80s, fighting against apartheid in South Africa and for divestment and boycott from the South African regimes and the economic firms. But they also have been impacted upon the anti-austerity protest, as well as the Arab Spring, with the idea of developing spaces of encounters. The occupations of the 60s are also a point of reference, but what we see is also something new, because in these spaces, different performances have been developed, and some of them seems to be particularly linked to the different generations that participate. In some occasions, camps have been also spaces of encounters of different generations, classes, ethnic groups. Think about Gezi parks in Istanbul or Puerta del Sol in Madrid. So there are movements in which different generations take part, also often contribute to create arenas in which these different generations meet. They contribute to this transfer, but also innovations of the frames. One of the main claim by the students is not only the ceasefire, but also the can say development of an ideas of the universities that is not a place for making profits or building military capacity, but rather a space for free speech, innovative thinking, and so on. And also these in cooperations between different generations aim in naming new type of movements on the basis of this tension between the memory of the past and the innovation, so sort of interactions. So this is a general introductions in terms of how and why generations are important vis-a-vis the current movements. I want to take now a step back and look at some of the categories that are useful, sociological concepts that are usually important to keep in mind when looking at this type of interactions. We know that sociology has many categories that are oriented to describe characteristics connected with age. Cohort is usually a statistical aggregate based on age, and very often in research on political behavior, we see that different type of behaviors are analyzed, also according to the participations of different cohorts. In some way with age, there is expectations that some types of behaviors tend to be abandoned and others tend to be instead become more relevant. Traditionally in research on political participations, the idea is that forms of institutional participations are mainly populated by middle-aged people, while social movements are more for the younger cohorts. But there is also another ways in which age is looked at in research on generations in social movements. And this is by looking at the specific characteristic of the young people. There is an approach that is developed in demography, which also is linked particular waves of protest to particular moment related with demographic changes, especially demographic boom has been an interpretation used for the movement of the 60s. But there is also the idea that young people contribute with social movements, also given some type of specific characteristics that usually scholars analyze under the label of biographical availability. That is the availability of free time, but also the importance that has been studied by scholars like Crossley and others of some specific spaces like the university campus for creating networks and interactions. And then there is the terms that I've used since until now, the idea of generations, that is something more than a cohort, because it is a cohort that is characterized by the fact that in their youth something particularly important happens. So usually the baby boom generations is related also with the importance of the accelerated transformations happening during the 60s. And what we saw in our research is that often activists consider generations as characterized by experiences in relatively short periods, especially related with peaks of social movements. So we have a Black Lives Matter generations, we have Fridays for Future generations that are concepts that could be relevant if we connect them with the specific experiences of movement participants in a particularly intense moment of protest. Generations in movement in particular have been looked at, for instance, by Jack Goldstone as a moment in which large youth cohort produce specific challenges. But we can also think at the type of demographic transformations that have an impact on social movements also recently. For instance, those related with migration trends, those related with the emergence of second generations of citizens with migrant backgrounds, and the important challenges also coming from the transformations in demographic trend. There is something also connected with the idea of young and some generations. Olivier Fillol, joking a bit, called of a Pampers syndrome. So the tendency of describing young people of new generations as characterized by enthusiasm, but also sometimes lack of responsibility and so on. And while this is a caricatural type of approach, what is important is also to consider how specific steps in the life experience bring about specific assessment of risks, but also specific assessment of sort of empowerment in terms of hope in the capacity of transforming the world. Generations are also important because of the political socializations that happens within new movements. Scholars like Doug McAdam and others have looked also at the ways in which activism becomes persistent and the type of biographical effect that participations in movements has on the activists who participate, and to a certain extent also to the ways in which they then moving in their normal adult life introduce changes. If we think about the debate about the effects of 1968, this has been often connected with the presence of activists that have learned during their activist experiences to value freedom, to value dissent, to value protest itself. Finally, it is interesting to look at the ideas of generations in terms also of distinguishing movements according to their capacity to connect generations. As I mentioned in the very first presentations talking about the movements of nowadays, sometimes the cross-generational encounters are happen almost by chance through the encounters in some specific spaces, but then the way in which movements deal with generational specificities, generational tensions can vary, and the effect then can be different. For instance, studying the feminist movement in recent years, we noticed that while in some countries there has been more of an availability of older generations of feminists to enter in contact with the new one, in other ones there have been more tensions. Also, what we noticed through focus groups on the global justice movements in the past was that in this movement that was described as a movement made of multiple generations, we conducted focus group divided by age, and each focus group started with the very definitions of the us activists coming from the resistance against fascism or coming from the experience of the 68 movement, of coming from the experience of the peace movement in the 80s. So this type of characteristics remained embedded. The young is important elements. I mentioned them previously. Scholars like the first ones who studied social movements like Lipset and Altbach have also looked at the enthusiasm and the idealism, capacity to be exposed to new ideas. Others have criticized the type of more emotional and rebellious attitudes. This has been then criticized, especially by social movement scholars who have looked at the ways in which social movements also socialized to more structured and effective ways to promote and produce new ideas and new practices. Biographical availability, I mentioned, is also characteristics of the youth, the networks at the universities, and this type of values that characterize young generations as being more oriented towards more ideal than materialistic type of aims. So how do we study generations, age, cohort in movement? Here I have some examples. I don't want to go in depth in them, but just to point at the fact that it has been important in research on social movements using, for instance, surveys at demonstrations to look at the ways in which the young people constitute the larger cohort, the larger part, let's say, of protest. This is the European Social Forum analyzed in Florence in 2002. And as you can see, in this Tuscany and others, Italian and non-Italian, but anyhow, what you see is that most of the protesters, 80% are were belong 35 years, and many of them were even teenagers or just in between 19 and 25. So this to say that what are the effect of the participations of young people in movement is an important issue to study, because they constitute very often the larger part of the protest. Largest part, but often it is interesting also that movements tend to have a diverse type of composition. So here it is another research in which we used surveys on different type of protest. And the type of distributions of the different cohort changed very dramatically. It's a paper I wrote with Massimiliano Andretta comparing Italy and Spain, but you can see that some types of protest, like the most traditional one, are participated at very high level by older generations. Some issues are more dominated by older generations. Others are more mixed, and still others are characterized instead by a very large presence of the youth, as I mentioned. This has, I think, long-lasting effect. If we want to explain the development of social movements nowadays in different European countries, for instance, countries like Spain and Greece that we were more mobilized during the financial crisis, are countries in which still those type of innovative ideas, alternative political positions have been carried inside institutions by the young activists of the movement themselves, and still the effects of those protests are very visible. Finally, just to give last, I think it is the last examples on the ways in which surveys have been used to analyze social movements, looking at the ways in which movements tend to develop. This is the European Social Forum in 2002, 2003, and 2006. The European Social Forum is an encounters of European social movements that has been particularly relevant in the beginnings of the years 2000 to develop alternative ideas of Europe and the critique of neoliberalism. And what we notice is that often in time, with the institutionalizations of some form of protest, the younger people tend to be less attracted, and the oldest generations tend instead to be more visible. So This is also, I think, an interesting element because we can connect that also with some transformations in the characteristics of the movement. But I wanted to look also more behind this quantitative data and looking at the ways in which different generations are also formed within movements and contribute to some of the characteristics of the movement themselves. This is a table which comes from a research that I carried out with Lorenzo Bosi here at Cosmos at the Scuola Normale Superiore, trying to compare sort of ethno-nationalist movements that had been particularly radicalized. In our examples came from Italy with the Red Brigades, Spain in the Basque countries with ETA, and the IRA in the Northern Ireland. And what we noted was that these movements, organizations, and then underground political organizations tended to change in time, also on the basis of the generations that participated in them. So very often we noted that there was a sort of changes characterized by, in the beginning, people that had been strongly socialized within the family, then a sort of role, important role paid by the organizations in the recruitment of new groups, and then also sort of transformations with the effects of the actions of the radical organizations being very visible on the new generations that were socialized already in a radicalized environment. So I took this example to point also at the importance of looking at ways in which long-standing social movements tend to be transformed by the arrival of new activists belonging of generations that have been socialized into an environment in which social movements had already produced some type of effects. Last part of my contributions is related with research that we did at the Scuola Normale with Martin Portos, Niccolò Bertuzzi, Daniela Chironi, and Chiara Milan, that was oriented to understand the ways in which young activists mobilized in different types of movements, from the feminist movements to the environmental movement, and also on cultural issues. And what we found important was also to see how generations perceived of themselves. I've mentioned introducing the contemporary situations that the generations of the activists who organized the pro-Palestine camps in Europe and in the United States is a generation of the crisis, as this sort of self-assessment as a generation that has been born and grown up in what sociologists have called as a polycrisis environment. When we did our research a few years ago, the terms that emerged more often in the self-definition is the term of precarious. And in fact, it is interesting to look at the ways in which around precarity, a lot of the frames and the forms of actions have converged, not only in the movements that I mentioned, but also, for instance, in the re-emergence, revival of labor protests that often mobilize young migrants, scholars. And these definitions of precarities is a definitions of precarity not only on the labor market, but also of precarity of life, which characterize not only the claims of this movement, but also the ways in which they tend to organize. And I will say something about this. What emerged as also very strongly from our interviews was the self-definitions as a precarious generations that didn't have a future. This was not definitions that brought about demobilizations, but rather the perceptions that a future could not be taken for granted, but had to be constructed. So that against the existential type of precarity that deprived young people of a future, mobilizations was a need in order to create the space and opportunities for survival. This was the perceptions of the social conditions in which the young people we interviewed were living through. What was interesting was also the connection they made with political situations in which young people felt they didn't have representations. Their voices were not listened to. Democracy, what's democracy? You tell us we are entitled to everything and then we get nothing, told us a Spanish young activist. So it is a generation that perceive the state as no longer performing the task that have legitimated democracy, like the insurance of a modicum of welfare state and social type of right. But politically, this is also what we define as an orphan generation, because it is a generation that perceive itself as abandoned by those political actors on the left that were supposed to instead defend the rights, the future of the young people. So there was also a political frustrations that did not ended up in apathy, but rather in the creations of alternative. And this we could also see in the type of repertoires, that the type of forms of actions that the young activists tended to produce. Often activists told us even social movement organizations, even progressive groups organized by older generations do not consider our taste, our time, our characteristics. So they perceive this organizational format as not welcoming. What they perceived as different was the perceptions of time. So it's a generation that told we don't have time for meetings that last for 4, 5, 6 hours. We want to do things. We want to communicate. We want to be politically active, but not bored by the type of organizational structures that other generations built. And in fact, what was very important was the insistence on the idea to especially build one's own spaces. So what in social movements we often analyze under the label of prefiguration. It is a space where people are meant to be living in. It is a space to exist. It is a space in which the values of the generations are formed but also enacted. And in fact, what we saw is something that we observed later on also in the different movements, like the Ni Una Menos of the feminist type of movements that are made especially of young people. The attempt to create form of activism in which caring from each other, but also engaging in activities that would bring life, joy, and resistance, as these activists mentioned, was particularly relevant. These are citations from the UK, which was another case we looked at. And we saw that it was particularly important for these generations, as it had been for previous generations, but even more now, also creating alternative in terms of sport, free life, cultures, and so on. So we notice also transgenerational differences in the repertoire of actions, and the ways in which the camps that I mentioned in the beginning, communal living, sharing, and so on, became particularly important for these generations. I see that I'm talking too much, so what I just want to go is a conclusions, and then I will use the previous slides maybe in our discussions. So concluding, precarious generations, and we have to see also to which extent the characteristics of our research done a few years ago still hold for the new generations of activism, academia. Precarious generations, which means economically unstable, socially fragmented, culturally sort of isolated from the rest and politically disillusioned, but also mobilizations that have been developing can be characterized as organizationally transient, changing quickly in time, often mediated through new technologies that allows for different levels of participation and the switching on and off of the forms of organizations. The immediate performances oriented to also prefigurate in the political activism, the values that are considered as part and parcel of their identity. And then intersectional inclusive framing, in which there is more and more the perceptions of the values of differences, but also the challenges to bring these differences into a common stream of mobilization. I think I will stop now. Thank you very much for your attention. I come back on screen.